Well, here we see some vertebrae with the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And we know the spinal nerves leave the spinal cord at 31 levels. So here we see the body of the vertebrae, the spinal cord running up and down. So if we take the spinal cord out of there, we can see that nice gap for the spinal cord to run in and out of. Now I want to contextualise this anatomy with the diagrams we've been looking at of the spinal cord. So if we move on to this diagram here, this is the sort of thing we've been looking at. We've seen the peripheral nociceptors, in this case in the skin. This would be the dermis. The dendrite of the sensory neuron going up to the sensory neuron cell body in this area, which is the dorsal root ganglia. And all of this is going to be surrounded by the vertebrae. So this would be the body of the vertebrae here, the bony body of the vertebrae. And over here, we've got the other part of the vertebrae. And this would be the transverse process. This would be the other transverse process on the other side. This is the spinous process. This is the knobbly bit you can feel when you feel someone from the back. And here there would be muscle. So we see that the spinal cord is protected within the bony spinal canal. And all the way inside that we've got the white matter of the spinal cord and inside the grey matter of the spinal cord. This diagram is illustrating the action of local anesthetics. So here we have the skin, the nociceptors, the dendrite of the sensory neuron, the cell body, the axon of the sensory neuron, which of course goes into the spinal cord. And here we see this area is blocked by the action of lignocaine, blocking the sodium channels. So even although a pain impulse is generated here, when this is injured or sutured or whatever it is, the nerve impulse will still be generated and it will start to propagate along the dendrite, but it will be blocked at this point. Completely blocked there if the anaesthetic is given effectively, meaning no painful impulses can get through to the cell body, to the axon, to the spinal cord, and therefore cannot get through to the brain. So the painful impulse is blocked at the area of dendrite, anaesthetised by the blocking of the sodium channels. Well, this diagram illustrates again the epidermis, and the dermis would be here. And we see there's nociceptors in the dermis, connected to the dendrite of the sensory neuron. Maybe just colour the sensory neuron in green here. Going to the cell body of the sensory neuron, along the axon of the sensory neuron, and into the spinal cord. There's then a synapse here, and there's another neuron just here, a relay neuron, very short one in this case, and that is connecting to another neuron here which decussates, which goes across and then goes up towards the brain in the spinothalamic tract. Now, is this a C fibre or is this an A delta fibre? Well, we said that the A delta fibres do not have relay neurons. If this was an A fibre carrying fast, sharp pain, then it would synapse directly with the secondary neuron. But because there's a relay neuron, we can infer from this that this is a C fibre carrying slower, achy type, duller pains up to the brain. So here we see the vertebral column with the bodies of the vertebrae and the intervertebral discs. And here we see the spinal nerves. So a nerve impulse coming in at any level of the spinal cord is going to go in through the spinal nerve into the spinal cord to ascend upwards towards the brain. And you can probably just see the spinal cord in between the vertebrae there. So the impulse comes in at a particular level, then ascends up the spinal cord towards the brain. So here we see a nociceptor in the dermis, following the afferent nerve pathway to the cell body and into the spinal cord, into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And the reason I put this diagram on is it actually shows a possible mechanism of referred pain. Because here we see an internal structure, could be the heart, could be part of the intestine, whatever it is, could be a gallbladder. And that's also got afferent sensory neurons going in, at this case, at the same level of the spinal cord. Still got its own cell body, its own axon going into the dorsal horn. But what we find is there's more nerves going in to the spinal cord when you count all the levels than there is ascending neurons going up to the brain. So here we have the ascending neuron going up to the brain, crossing over and going up. But what we notice is both of these, the afferent from the internal structure and the afferent from the external structure, are both sharing the same ascending neuron. There's two little relay neurons here, one connected to the internal structure, one connected to the external structure, but both sharing the same ascending secondary order neuron. Now what this means is most of the time when impulses go up this neuron to the brain will interpret that as coming from this area of the body, the surface area of the body. That's what the brain will be used to. That's what happens most commonly. But then one day, if an internal structure starts generating pain and it shares the same pathway, there's still an impulse going up here, but this time it's come from here, from the internal structure, not from the surface of the body. So the brain can mistakenly interpret this ascending impulse as coming from here, when in actual fact today it's come from here. So instead of feeling the pain here where it's generated, the pain can be felt or experienced in this part of the body here, because of shared ascending tracks in the spinal cord. So that's one possible mechanism to explain the existence of referred pain. The pain is generated here, but it's actually experienced here. It is referred to another part of the body. Well, here's another diagram. We see the spinal cord, the brain stem, the thalamus and the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And we notice that the second order neuron is coming up the spinal cord, up the left side of the spinal cord, through the brain stem terminating in the thalamus, and then there's a third order neuron going from the thalamus to the sensory cortex. The thalamocortical neuron is the first order neuron. Sorry, the third order neuron. So in this context, the first order neuron is going from the periphery into the spinal cord. The second order neuron is going across the spinal cord and up the spinal cord. And the third order neuron is going from the thalamus to the sensory cortex. And the part of the thalamus that this actually goes to is called the ventral posterior lateral. The ventral posterior lateral nucleus, sometimes the VPL nucleus in the thalamus. From there, the thalamocortical third order neuron goes to the sensory lobes. Now, it's always a little more complicated, of course, because there's actually two parts to the spinothalamic tract. The C fibres tend to travel up in a more medial pathway. So here we have the spinal cord, and as we know, there's the grey matter and the white matter. Now, we know that the neuron comes in, synapses, goes across and goes up towards the brain. Well, this is the spinothalamic tract here, and this is the spinothalamic tract that tends to carry the fast pain impulses straight up towards the sensory cortex, where it can be well localized. But there's actually a more medial branch of the spinothalamic tract as well, nearer the middle. There's a more medial tract, and these tracts go up to the, I'm going to use a long word here, periaqueductal grey matter. Don't worry about it just now, we will be looking at it later. And some of these go to the hypothalamus and reticular system, so they go up as well. But these are going to other parts of the brain, the lower parts of the brain, and these are primarily derived from the C fibres, the achy, slower types of pain. So some are going to the limbic areas, hypothalamus, and others to the reticular system. The reticular system is what causes activation of the brain, it keeps you awake, and the limbic system and the hypothalamus are involved in emotional responses. So this more medial spinothalamic tract, sometimes called the paleospinothalamic tract, these are going to other areas of the brain, causing distress, causing upset, the patient feels upset, causing wakefulness, and what you might call the suffering aspects of pain. Some do go on to the thalamus and are relayed onto the sensory cortex, giving rise to some localization of pain. But as we've said before, these achy sorts of pains aren't as well localized as the faster, sharper types of pain. But they do go to other areas of the brain. They do cause suffering, distress, anxiety and upset, and they do cause wakefulness as well. So there's the fast part of the spinothalamic tract, which is more lateral, and more medially there's the older part of the spinothalamic tract, the so-called paleospinothalamic tract, going up to the brain, carrying C fibres, causing suffering, distress, and, as we've seen here, some localization of the pain, but not as precise localization as the fast pain fibres.